My name is Marigold Goldie Thistlewood, though most people these days seem to forget it entirely. I arrived at my niece Clara's wedding feeling like a queen, or at least that's how I dressed for the occasion. My vintage emerald green silk dress shimmered under the summer sun as I stepped out of the cab, clutching my mother's heirloom clutch in one hand and a bottle of homemade elderflower liqueur in the other. The vineyard was stunning, all rolling hills and golden light, but something about the atmosphere felt off from the moment I walked through those wrought iron gates. As soon as I greeted Eleanor, my younger sister by 10 years, she barely glanced up from her clipboard. "Oh, Goldie," she said dismissively, waving me toward the guest tent without even making eye contact. "Just find your seat, we're running behind." Running behind? This was her daughter's wedding day, not some corporate gala. Still, I smiled politely and wandered over to where Richard, Eleanor's perpetually frazzled husband, stood adjusting his tie. He gave me a sympathetic look but didn't say much. It wasn't until later, when I tried to share a story about Clara's childhood with Sophie, the maid of honor, that I realized no one wanted to hear what I had to say. Sophie laughed nervously and muttered something about needing to check on the flower arrangements, leaving me standing there alone, clutching my clutch like a lifeline. By the time the rehearsal dinner rolled around, I'd already started noticing patterns. Eleanor kept shooting me side-eye whenever I suggested anything, whether it was rearranging the seating chart or reminding her that Clara used to love lavender instead of roses. "Goldie, please," she snapped after my third attempt to interject during a discussion about table settings. "We've got this covered." Covered? If neglecting half the guests counted as covered, then yes, they certainly did. But the real dagger came when I overheard Sophie whispering to another bridesmaid near the dessert table. "Honestly," Sophie said loud enough for me to catch every word, "she's just Aunt Goldie. Who cares what she thinks?" My stomach churned. Just Aunt Goldie? After everything I'd done for this family, for Clara, I was reduced to nothing more than an afterthought. I spent the rest of the evening forcing smiles and pretending not to notice how everyone else seemed too busy fawning over Mr. Bernard Langley, Richard's flashy business partner, to pay me any mind. That night, lying awake in my hotel room, I decided I wouldn't let them treat me like I didn't exist anymore. They wanted invisible? Fine. But invisibility could work both ways. The next morning, I woke up early and headed straight to the venue, determined to prove myself useful despite their indifference. As I adjusted a centerpiece in the reception hall, I couldn't help but overhear Eleanor gushing to Bernard about how stressful it was to plan such a high-profile event. High profile? For heaven's sake, it was a wedding, not a state dinner. When I finally mustered the courage to offer a few suggestions during breakfast setup, Eleanor cut me off mid-sentence. "Let's save the speeches for later, shall we?" she chirped, gesturing toward the dessert cart. Later never came. Still, I refused to give up entirely. During the rehearsal dinner that evening, I stood up to deliver a heartfelt toast about Clara's journey from a curious little girl to the poised woman she'd become today. I only made it 3 sentences in before Eleanor interrupted me yet again. "Oh look, dessert's here," she announced cheerfully, clapping her hands like a schoolteacher trying to distract unruly children. The room erupted into applause as servers wheeled out trays of macarons and tarts. No one noticed, or cared, that I sat back down without finishing my speech. Frustration bubbled inside me like boiling water, but I channeled it into observation. Over the next few days, I began piecing together secrets hidden beneath the veneer of perfection. For instance, I discovered Eleanor had secretly dipped into the wedding fund to cover her own mounting credit card debt, a fact she desperately hoped would stay buried. Then there was Sophie, whose constant flirting with the groomsmen masked a deeper issue. She was having an affair with one of them. And poor Clara. Well, Clara confided in Sophie one afternoon that she felt suffocated by expectations, torn between pleasing her mother and fitting into her fiancé's elite social circle. Each revelation fueled my growing resentment. How dare they dismiss me while drowning in their own messes? By the end of the second day, I'd formulated a plan. A subtle yet effective way to expose their flaws without directly implicating myself. After all, revenge didn't have to be loud to be satisfying. It could whisper its way into their lives, unraveling everything they held dear bit by bit. I started small, planting seeds of chaos wherever I went. One morning, I accidentally spilled coffee on Eleanor's meticulously color-coded seating chart, forcing her to redo hours of work. Another time, I convinced the caterer that the bride preferred vegetarian options, knowing full well Clara hated tofu. Every misstep sent ripples of panic through the wedding party, though none of them suspected me. Why would they? To them I was just Aunt Goldie, the invisible bystander who blended seamlessly into the background. Things escalated quickly once I realized how easy it was to manipulate the situation. On the eve of the wedding, I slipped into the bridal suite and tucked Clara's veil into the bottom drawer of an antique dresser, ensuring it wouldn't be found until long after the ceremony was supposed to begin. Watching Eleanor scramble to locate it filled me with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Finally, someone was paying attention, to the wrong things perhaps, but still. Then came the storm. Literally. Dark clouds gathered overhead just as guests began taking their seats for the outdoor ceremony. Chaos erupted as staff scrambled to move chairs and decorations indoors, leaving Eleanor in tears and Sophie snapping orders at anyone within earshot. Amid the pandemonium, I calmly directed traffic, barking commands like a general leading troops into battle. Miraculously, we managed to salvage the setup just in time for the rain to subside. For a brief moment, Eleanor actually thanked me. "You saved us, Goldie," she said, clutching my arm. Her gratitude lasted exactly 5 minutes, just long enough for her to regain control of the situation before pushing me aside again. That's when I knew my exit needed to be as dramatic as the storm itself. The betrayal that cut deepest came not from Eleanor, whose dismissiveness I'd grown accustomed to, but from Clara herself. That evening, after the storm had passed and the wedding party was finally settling into their roles, I found her pacing nervously near the garden fountain. She looked so much like her mother in that moment, frustrated, fidgeting with her pearl bracelet, but there was a vulnerability in her eyes that made me soften. "Clara," I said gently, approaching her. "Is everything all right?" She hesitated before answering, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might overhear us. "Aunt Goldie," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need you to promise me something." When I nodded, she continued, "Please, just try not to embarrass me today. I know you mean well, but..." Her words trailed off, but the implication hung heavy between us. Embarrass her? After all I'd done for her, all the times I'd been there when her own mother wasn't, she saw me as a liability, a relic of the past best kept out of sight. My chest tightened as if an invisible hand were squeezing my heart. Without another word, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone by the fountain. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Clara's face. The hesitation, the guilt, the unspoken plea. It wasn't just disappointment I felt, it was rage. Not the kind of fiery anger that burns hot and fast, but the slow, simmering sort that festers in the dark corners of your soul. By sunrise I'd decided, they wanted invisible? Fine. But invisibility could be a weapon too. I started with Sophie. The next morning, while everyone else was distracted with last-minute preparations, I slipped into the groomsmen's suite and left a carefully placed note on one of the beds. A fake love letter signed ambiguously enough to implicate Sophie in her affair. Then, during brunch, I casually mentioned to Eleanor how surprised I was that she hadn't noticed discrepancies in the catering invoices. "You're usually so detail-oriented," I remarked innocently, watching as panic flickered across her face. By midday, whispers of scandal rippled through the venue, though no one dared point fingers directly. Yet, by the time the ceremony began, chaos was already brewing beneath the surface. Guests murmured about missing hors d'oeuvres and misplaced programs, unaware that I'd orchestrated each mishap with precision. But the piece de resistance came when Eleanor realized Clara's veil was missing. Panic spread like wildfire as staff tore apart the bridal suite, searching every drawer and closet. Meanwhile, I sat calmly in the front row, sipping champagne and pretending to console a distraught Richard. When the officiant announced a delay in the proceedings, the tension in the air became palpable. Eleanor paced back and forth, muttering under her breath, while Sophie frantically tried to calm the increasingly restless crowd. Clara emerged from the bridal suite looking pale and shaken, her hair hastily pinned up without the veil. As she took her place at the altar, I caught her eye briefly. For a split second she looked at me, not with gratitude or affection but with suspicion. Good. Let her wonder. The reception was a spectacle of forced smiles and thinly veiled frustration. Eleanor delivered a stiff toast, attempting to smooth over the day's disasters, but her voice cracked halfway through. Sophie avoided eye contact with anyone, clearly aware that rumors about her affair were spreading faster than the appetizers. And Clara? Clara barely spoke, her usual radiance dulled by exhaustion and unease. Then it was my turn. When the MC called for speeches, I rose slowly, clutching my glass of wine. All eyes turned to me, some curious, others indifferent. I cleared my throat and began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Family is supposed to be our anchor, I said, letting the words hang in the air. But sometimes anchors drag us down instead of holding us steady. I paused, meeting Clara's gaze before continuing. I've spent years being the invisible support system, the one who cleans up messes and keeps quiet. Well, no more. From now on, you'll see me loud and clear, even if it's only in your memories. With that, I set my glass down and walked out of the tent, leaving stunned silence in my wake. The cool night air hit my face as I strode toward the parking lot, my heels clicking against the pavement. For the first time in days, I felt alive. The drive back to my lakeside cottage felt like an escape from a battlefield where I'd finally claimed victory, or so I told myself. The quiet hum of the car engine and the rhythmic sway of trees along the winding road should have brought me peace, but instead, guilt gnawed at the edges of my satisfaction. My phone buzzed incessantly as I ignored call after call from Clara, Eleanor, and even Richard. They wanted explanations, apologies, anything to make sense of what had happened. But I didn't owe them clarity. Not anymore. When I arrived home, I poured myself a glass of red wine and sat by the fireplace, replaying the day's events in my mind. Each memory was tinged with bitterness. Eleanor's panicked face when she realized the veil was missing, Sophie's furtive glances during the reception, Clara's accusing stare as I walked out. And yet, beneath the vindication lay a hollow ache. Had I gone too far? No, I decided firmly. They deserved every ounce of discomfort they felt. Still, as midnight approached and the house grew eerily silent, loneliness crept in like a thief in the night. Days turned into weeks, and the fallout from the wedding became impossible to ignore. News traveled fast in our small town, especially gossip about the Hawthorne family's disastrous celebration. Eleanor reportedly suffered a minor breakdown shortly after the event, canceling several high-profile charity meetings she'd been planning for months. Sophie, on the other hand, found herself ostracized by mutual acquaintances once rumors of her affair surfaced. Even Clara wasn't spared. Whispers circulated that her marriage was already strained, though no one dared say it aloud. Meanwhile, I retreated further into solitude, avoiding invitations to local gatherings and deflecting concerned calls from old friends. Yet, despite my resolve to cut ties, guilt continued to haunt me. One afternoon, while sorting through boxes in the attic, I stumbled upon an old photo album filled with pictures of Clara as a child. Her gap-toothed grin, her messy pigtails, her unbridled joy during summers spent at my cottage. Tears blurred my vision as I traced the edge of one faded photograph. How could someone who had once meant so much to me now feel like a stranger? It wasn't until Richard showed up unexpectedly at my door that I began to see cracks in my carefully constructed fortress of revenge. He looked older than I remembered, his shoulders slumped under the weight of unseen burdens. "Goldie," he said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Over tea he confessed things I'd never imagined. Eleanor, it seemed, had been drowning in debt for years, using the wedding as a desperate attempt to secure financial stability through Clara's new in-laws. Sophie's affair wasn't just scandalous, it was symptomatic of deeper issues within the bridal party, including jealousy and resentment. And Clara. Poor Clara had been caught in the crossfire, torn between pleasing her mother and asserting her independence. As Richard spoke, I felt pieces of my anger crumble, replaced by a sorrow I couldn't quite name. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because," he replied, "someone has to start repairing the damage. And I think it should be you." Richard's words lingered long after he left, stirring emotions I'd buried deep inside. For days I wrestled with conflicting desires, the urge to maintain my righteous indignation versus the pull toward reconciliation. In the end, curiosity won out. I called Clara, not to apologize but to ask how she was doing. Her response came as a voicemail, hesitant and halting. "Aunt Goldie," she began, "I don't know where to start. Everything feels broken. Mom's a mess, Sophie's gone, and James," she paused, choking back tears. "James says he needs space. I don't blame him. Hearing her voice shattered something inside me. This wasn't the confident young woman I'd watched walk down the aisle. It was a fragile girl desperate for guidance. Against my better judgment, I drove to her apartment the next morning. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. "I thought you hated me," she whispered, hugging me tightly before I could respond. In that moment I realized my revenge hadn't just hurt them, it had hurt me too. Clara and I spent hours talking that day, unpacking the layers of tension that had built up over years. She admitted feeling suffocated by expectations, torn between loyalty to her family and her desire to forge her own path. I, in turn, confessed my feelings of invisibility and betrayal. By the time evening fell, we were both emotionally drained but lighter somehow, as if sharing our pain had lifted part of its weight. Before leaving, Clara handed me a letter she'd written days earlier, a heartfelt apology explaining why she'd distanced herself. "I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of disappointing everyone. Scared of losing myself." I promised to read it later, tucking it into my purse without looking at it. That night, sitting alone by the lake, I stared at the envelope, torn between burning it and opening it. Ultimately, I chose neither. Instead, I placed it on my bedside table, a reminder of the fragile bridge we were trying to rebuild. Weeks passed and life began to settle into a fragile rhythm. Eleanor avoided me completely, which suited me fine, though Richard occasionally stopped by to update me on her condition. Sophie vanished from social circles altogether, rumored to have moved out of state. As for Clara, she and James decided to postpone their honeymoon indefinitely, citing personal reasons. Whether their marriage would survive remained uncertain, but at least they were attempting to navigate their challenges together. One crisp autumn morning I received another letter, this time from Clara's lawyer. It was a formal request for space, signed jointly by both her and James. The note accompanying it was brief. "Thank you for everything, Aunt Goldie. I'll reach out when I'm ready." Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. Space. Just like the others, she needed space. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the paper until nothing remained but ash. Winter arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the world in snow and forcing me indoors for days on end. The solitude that had once felt empowering now smothered me like a heavy quilt. I spent hours staring out the window at the frozen lake, replaying Clara's final letter in my mind. "I'll reach out when I'm ready." What did that even mean? Was she trying to protect herself from further harm, or was she simply done with me altogether? The silence became unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, seemed amplified in the absence of human connection. I tried distracting myself by baking pies and knitting scarves, but no matter how busy I kept my hands, my thoughts always circled back to the same question. Had I destroyed the only family I had left? One evening, unable to stand the quiet any longer, I turned on the radio just to hear another voice. A melancholy jazz tune filled the room, its mournful notes mirroring my mood. For the first time in months I cried, not out of anger or regret but from sheer loneliness. By spring, rumors about the Hawthorne family had faded from public conversation, replaced by newer scandals and gossip. Eleanor resurfaced briefly, hosting a charity gala to rebuild her image, though few attended. Richard filed for divorce shortly thereafter, citing irreconcilable differences. Sophie remained absent, her name occasionally whispered in hushed tones whenever someone mentioned affairs gone wrong. And Clara? Well, Clara stayed silent. One afternoon, while browsing through a bookstore in town, I spotted Bernard Langley, the flashy businessman who'd been fawned over during the wedding, chatting animatedly with a group of acquaintances. He noticed me too, his smile faltering slightly before he approached. "Mrs. Thistlewood," he said politely, extending a hand. "How have you been?" "Fine," I lied, shaking his hand briefly. We exchanged pleasantries until he casually remarked, "Such a shame about young Clara's marriage, isn't it? Heard they're calling it quits." My heart sank. Calling it quits? No one had told me anything official, but Bernard's words carried the ring of truth. I mumbled an excuse and hurried out of the store, clutching my purchases tightly as if they could shield me from the weight of his revelation. That night I couldn't sleep. Images of Clara's face haunted me, her radiant smile on her wedding day, her tear-streaked cheeks as she handed me that letter. How had it come to this? I wandered into the attic again, drawn inexplicably to the old photo album I'd found months earlier. Flipping through its pages, I realized something painful yet undeniable. Clara hadn't been the only one suffocating under expectations. I'd built walls around myself long before the wedding, using invisibility as both armor and prison. In a moment of desperation, I called Richard. "Do you know anything about Clara's divorce?" I asked bluntly, skipping pleasantries. There was a long pause before he sighed heavily. "She filed last week," he admitted. "James cited irreconcilable differences, but we all know it's more than that. She blames herself for everything." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Blames herself? How could she think this mess was entirely her fault? The next morning, I drove to Eleanor's house unannounced. She opened the door looking gaunt and exhausted, her usual polished appearance replaced by sweatpants and a baggy sweater. "Goldie," she said, startled. "What are you doing here?" "I need answers," I replied, stepping inside without waiting for permission. The house was eerily quiet, devoid of the usual clatter of staff or guests. In the living room, Eleanor collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through her disheveled hair. "It's over," she murmured. "Everything's falling apart. Richard left, Clara won't speak to me, and..." Her voice broke, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, I felt sorry for her. Not because she deserved pity, but because she was finally confronting the consequences of her actions. Still, sympathy didn't erase the damage she'd caused, to Clara, to our family, to me. As I sat beside her, listening to her sobs, I realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing bad behavior. It was about letting go of the poison it left behind. Eleanor's breakdown marked the beginning of the end for us as a family. Within weeks, she moved to Florida to live with an estranged cousin, leaving the house empty and neglected. Richard settled into a modest apartment downtown, focusing on rebuilding his life one day at a time. And Clara? Clara disappeared entirely. Months later, I received a package in the mail. A small wooden box containing Clara's missing veil, along with a note scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Found this in the dresser drawer. Thought you should have it. Love, C." The simplicity of the gesture struck me harder than any apology ever could. She hadn't signed off with Aunt or Goldie, just C. It was as if she were reclaiming her identity, piece by piece. Holding the veil in my hands, I felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. Relief that she'd reached out, however indirectly. Sorrow that our relationship might never fully recover. That night, I placed the veil in a drawer alongside the unopened letter she'd given me months ago. Together they formed a shrine to what we'd lost, and perhaps what we still hoped to find. Months turned into a year, and life settled into a quiet rhythm I hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. My lakeside cottage, once a sanctuary of memories and laughter, now felt like a mausoleum of what could have been. The veil Clara had sent me remained untouched in its drawer, a silent testament to the fractured bond we'd shared. I tried to fill the emptiness with routine, gardening, volunteering at the local library, attending weekly knitting circles, but nothing truly filled the void. One chilly November afternoon, I found myself wandering through Manhattan, aimlessly drifting from one street corner to another. It was there, amidst the bustling crowds and glittering storefronts, that I stumbled upon an old bookstore tucked between two towering skyscrapers. Inside, shelves groaned under the weight of forgotten stories, their spines cracked and faded with age. As I ran my fingers along the dusty titles, a particular book caught my eye, The Art of Letting Go. Something about the title resonated deeply, so I bought it on impulse. That night, sitting by the fire with a cup of tea, I opened the book and read the first line. "Forgiveness is not for others, it is for yourself." Tears welled up in my eyes as the words sank in. Perhaps it was time to let go, not just of Clara but of everything I'd clung to out of pride and pain. A few weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation. A simple card bearing Clara's name and address, asking me to meet her for lunch. My heart raced as I held the envelope, unsure whether to feel hope or dread. After days of deliberation, I decided to go, dressing carefully in my favorite navy blue dress and pearl earrings. When I arrived at the cafe where she'd suggested we meet, I spotted her immediately. She looked different somehow, older, wiser, yet still unmistakably the same girl who used to chase butterflies in my backyard. "Goldie," she said softly as I approached, standing to hug me. Her embrace was tentative but warm, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be okay again. Over soup and sandwiches we talked cautiously at first, skirting around the wounds of the past. Eventually Clara broke the silence. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For everything. For pushing you away, for letting fear dictate my choices. For not seeing how much you loved me until it was almost too late." Her apology unraveled something inside me, releasing emotions I'd buried long ago. "I'm sorry too," I admitted, gripping her hand tightly. "For hurting you, for making things worse instead of better. You deserved better than me." We sat there for hours, crying and laughing and piecing together fragments of our broken relationship. By the end of the meal we weren't fully healed, but we were closer than we'd been in years. In the months that followed, Claire and I began rebuilding our connection slowly, one conversation at a time. She told me about her struggles post-divorce, how she'd moved to a small coastal town to start over, finding solace in painting and teaching art to children. In return, I shared stories of my own loneliness, admitting how much I'd missed having her in my life. Though the scars of the past remained, they no longer defined us. One crisp spring morning, I stood on the porch of my cottage, watching the sun rise over the lake. Beside me sat a cardboard box filled with mementos from Clara's wedding: the misplaced menu cards, the broken champagne flute, the veil she'd returned. I lit a match and set them ablaze, watching as flames consumed the remnants of our shared history. It wasn't erasure, it was release. As the fire crackled and died, I whispered to myself, sometimes invisibility isn't inflicted, it's chosen. And for the first time in years I meant it. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows you to step out of its shadow and into the light. Though my family would never be whole again, I realized that wholeness isn't always about perfection. Sometimes it's about embracing the cracks and finding beauty in the broken pieces.